A millionaire businessman, always absent, decides to surprise his daughter by bringing her lunch to school. When he arrives at the cafeteria, he finds the girl isolated, head down, her eyes filled with tears. Right in front of him, the teacher dumps cold leftover food onto the child's plate and yells with calculated cruelty. What that father did next shocked everyone. The Hartford estate sat like a monument to success on the outskirts of Greenwich, Connecticut, its pristine white columns reflecting the afternoon sun. Inside the grand foyer, Richard Hartford adjusted his silk tie one final time before his driver arrived. His reflection in the gilded mirror showed a man in his early 40s, impeccably groomed, shoulders squared with the confidence of someone who had built an empire from calculated risks and unwavering focus. But his eyes, those steel-grey eyes that had intimidated countless boardroom adversaries, carried a weight that no amount of success could lift. The sound of small footsteps echoed from the marble staircase. Emily descended slowly, her 7-year-old frame almost swallowed by the vastness of the entrance hall. She wore her school uniform with meticulous precision, her blonde hair pulled back in a neat ponytail, but her posture was hesitant, as if she were apologizing for taking up space in her own home. Richard glanced at his watch. He had exactly 4 minutes before the car arrived, 4 minutes to acknowledge his daughter before another 12-hour day at Hartford Financial Group. He cleared his throat, the sound reverberating off the high ceilings. Emily stopped 3 steps from the bottom, her fingers gripping the banister. Her eyes, so much like her mother's had been, searched his face for something he did not know how to give. The silence stretched between them like an ocean. Neither knew how to cross. From the kitchen doorway, Margaret appeared, wiping flour from her weathered hands. At 58, the housekeeper had been with the Hartford family for nearly 2 decades. She had witnessed the joy of Emily's birth and the devastating aftermath when Sarah Hartford's time had come to an end 3 years ago. Margaret had stayed through it all, her presence a constant in a house that had become a mausoleum of memories. "Richard," she said softly, "Emily made you a drawing last night. Perhaps you could take a moment." He felt the familiar tightness in his chest, the one that came whenever anything threatened to pull him into the messiness of emotions. The company needed him. The quarterly reports were due. The merger with the Boston firm required his full attention. "I'll look at it tonight," he said, his tone clipped but not unkind. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet, extracting several crisp bills. "For your school supplies, Emily, whatever you need." Emily descended the final steps and took the money with both hands, as if it were something fragile. "Thank you, Father," she whispered. The horn sounded outside. Richard picked up. His briefcase gave a brief nod to Margaret and walked toward the door. He paused for just a moment, his hand on the brass handle, feeling the weight of his daughter's gaze on his back. But the weight of obligation was heavier, and he stepped into the morning without looking back. Margaret knelt beside Emily, placing a gentle hand on the girl's shoulder. "Come, sweet child, let's have breakfast together. I made your favorite blueberry pancakes." Emily nodded, but her eyes remained fixed on the closed door, as if willing it to open again, as if wishing her father would return and ask about the drawing she had spent hours creating, the one where they were holding hands under a bright yellow sun. The weeks passed in their predictable rhythm. Richard left before sunrise and returned after Emily's bedtime. Margaret filled the hours with lessons, games, and stories, trying to compensate for the emotional vacuum that permeated every corner of the grand house. Emily attended Riverside Academy, an exclusive private school where children arrived in luxury vehicles and departed the same way, their lives measured by achievement and pedigree. It was during a routine parent-teacher conference that everything began to shift. Richard had almost forgotten about the appointment, reminded only by Margaret's insistent note taped to his bathroom mirror. He arrived 20 minutes late, still on a phone call with Tokyo, and entered the bright classroom with the air of someone checking off an obligation. Victoria Ashford stood from her desk with a warm smile that seemed to illuminate the entire room. She was in her early 30s, dressed elegantly, but not ostentatiously, her auburn hair framing a face that radiated genuine warmth. Or so it appeared. "Mr. Hartford," she said, extending her hand, "thank you so much for..." Making time. I know how demanding your schedule must be. Her handshake was firm but not aggressive, her eyes meeting his with what seemed like sincere appreciation. Richard felt himself relax slightly, a rare occurrence in his carefully controlled world. Victoria gestured to a small chair beside her desk, one clearly designed for children. Richard looked at it with barely concealed amusement before she laughed softly. Perhaps we could use the chairs in the reading corner instead. Much more suitable for adults. They settled into the comfortable armchairs, and Victoria opened a folder containing Emily's work. Her approach was masterful, in its subtlety. She began with genuine observations about Emily's intelligence, her creativity, her gentle nature. She showed Richard drawings that demonstrated real artistic talent, essays that revealed a thoughtful mind beyond her years. "Your daughter is extraordinary, Mr. Hartford," Victoria said, her voice carrying a note of something that sounded like reverence. "But I sense she carries a sadness that breaks my heart." Richard shifted uncomfortably. The conversation was veering into territory he preferred to avoid. Victoria seemed to sense this and softened her approach even further. "I lost my father when I was young," she continued, her eyes glistening with what appeared to be authentic emotion. "I know what it's like when a child yearns for connection. I hope you don't mind me saying this, but I see so much potential in Emily. She just needs someone to help draw it out." Over the following weeks, Victoria's presence in their lives became increasingly frequent. It started with a phone call about Emily's slight cold, an offer to check on her during lunch. Then came the afternoon when Emily's temperature spiked and Victoria personally drove her home, arriving at the estate with honey and crackers, insisting that these home remedies always worked wonders. Margaret watched from the kitchen window as Victoria's car became a regular sight in the circular driveway. Something in her weathered heart whispered warnings, but they were nebulous, shapeless concerns that she could not articulate even to herself. Richard, isolated in his grief and buried in his work, saw only kindness. Victoria never pushed, never demanded. She simply appeared when needed, offering support that felt effortless. She remembered details about his business challenges, asked thoughtful questions about his late wife without being intrusive, and gradually became someone he looked forward to seeing. The transformation happened so gradually that no single moment could be identified as the turning point. Victoria's visits extended from minutes to hours. She began staying for dinner occasionally, helping Emily with homework at the dining table while Richard worked in his study. Margaret prepared the meals, served them with her usual efficiency, but felt herself becoming a ghost in her own domain. One evening, as Margaret cleared the dinner dishes, she noticed something odd. The framed photograph of Sarah Hartford that usually sat on the sideboard had been moved to a less prominent position. When she mentioned it to Richard, he seemed puzzled, saying he had not touched it. Victoria, overhearing the conversation, suggested gently that perhaps it had been accidentally bumped during cleaning. Her tone was so reasonable, so devoid of accusation, that Margaret felt foolish for bringing it up. But it happened again, and again. Small things. A vase relocated, Sarah's favorite cookbook missing from its shelf. The cushions in the library rearranged. Each incident was minor, easily explained, but together they formed a pattern that Margaret could not ignore. She tried to voice her concerns to Richard one morning as he prepared to leave for the office. "Mr. Hartford, I feel I must speak with you about something. It's regarding Miss Ashford." Richard paused, his hand on his briefcase. "Victoria has been incredibly helpful, Margaret. I'm grateful for her attention to Emily." "Of course, sir. But I've noticed certain changes in the household. Things being moved, routines being questioned. I wonder if perhaps we should establish some boundaries." Richard's expression hardened slightly. "Margaret, I appreciate your dedication to this family, but I think you may be overreacting. Victoria is a professional educator who has shown nothing but kindness to my daughter. If anything, she's brought some much-needed warmth to this house." The word stung more than Margaret cared to admit. She had been the source of warmth in this house for years, through the darkest times, and now she was being dismissed as paranoid. She nodded quietly and retreated to the kitchen, feeling the foundations of her position beginning to crack. Victoria's strategy was brilliant in its patience. She never confronted Margaret directly, never issued commands or challenged her authority. Instead, she operated through suggestion and gentle questioning. Why did Emily eat dinner so early? Wouldn't it be better for her to wait and eat with her father? Why were the curtains in the living room always drawn? Didn't natural light improve mood? Why did Margaret insist on such strict routines? Didn't children benefit from spontaneity? Each question was posed with such apparent concern for Emily's well-being that Richard began to see Margaret's methods as outdated rather than caring. Victoria positioned herself as the progressive voice of modern parenting while subtly painting the housekeeper as rigid and controlling. The proposal came on a quiet Sunday evening. Richard and Victoria sat in the library while Emily slept upstairs. The fire crackled softly, casting dancing shadows on the walls lined with leather-bound books. Victoria had been sharing stories about her own childhood, carefully crafted narratives that emphasized resilience and optimism. Richard found himself opening up in ways he had not done since Sarah's passing. "I know this might seem forward," Victoria said, her voice barely above a whisper, "but I've come to care deeply for Emily. And for you. I see how hard you work, how much you sacrifice. You deserve happiness, Richard. You deserve a partner who understands the weight you carry." 3 months later, they were married in a small ceremony at the estate. Emily stood beside them. In a white dress, her expression neutral, her eyes distant. Margaret attended out of duty, her heart heavy with foreboding she could not name. The guests were mostly Richard's business associates, people who congratulated him on finding companionship again, on giving his daughter a mother figure. Victoria moved into the master bedroom that very night. Within days, she began her systematic transformation of the household. New curtains replaced the old ones. Furniture was rearranged to create better flow, she explained. Sarah's china, carefully preserved in the dining room cabinet, was packed away because it was too delicate for everyday use. Photographs came down from walls, replaced with modern art pieces that Victoria said would help Richard move forward, rather than dwelling in the past. Emily watched silently as her mother's presence was erased from the house room by room. She said nothing when her bedroom was repainted from the soft lavender her mother had chosen to a stark white that Victoria insisted was more sophisticated. She did not protest when the stuffed animals that had lined her bed, gifts from her mother, were donated to charity because a girl her age should not be so attached to childish things. But, at night, alone in her redesigned room, Emily cried into her pillow and tried desperately to remember the sound of her mother's voice, the scent of her perfume, the warmth of her embrace. The memories were fading, slipping away like water through her fingers, and she felt herself disappearing along with them. Victoria's public persona remained impeccable. At school functions, she was the devoted stepmother, always praising Emily, always expressing concern for her development. But behind the closed doors of the Hertford estate, a different reality emerged. It began with small criticisms delivered in a tone of helpful correction. Emily's posture was not straight enough. Her table manners needed refinement. Her reading choices were too juvenile. Her artwork was messy and needed to be kept confined to designated areas. The rules multiplied. Emily was no longer allowed to eat breakfast with Margaret in the kitchen. That was inappropriate for a young lady of her station. Instead, she ate alone in the formal dining room under Victoria's watchful eye, learning proper etiquette through constant correction. Meals became performances of perfection, every movement scrutinized, every mistake noted. Margaret tried to intervene, but found herself systematically excluded from Emily's care. Victoria insisted that, as the girl's stepmother, she should handle all matters related to Emily's upbringing. Richard, relieved to finally have someone take charge of domestic affairs, supported this arrangement. He saw it as the natural order of things, a stepmother bonding with her new daughter. What he did not see were the notes Victoria began leaving for Emily, tucked into her school bag or slipped under her pillow. Little reminders written in elegant script about her failures, her shortcomings, her need to improve. He did not know about the diary Victoria forced Emily to keep, a catalogue of mistakes and pledges to do better. He did not witness the meals served cold, the portions deliberately insufficient, the punishment of isolation for infractions only Victoria seemed able to identify. Emily's eyes, once bright with hope despite her loneliness, became dull and hollow. Her body, never robust, grew thinner. Dark circles appeared beneath her eyes from sleepless nights filled with anxiety about what tomorrow would bring. She moved through the house like a shadow, trying to be invisible, trying not to provoke Victoria's displeasure. Margaret ached watching the transformation, but her attempts to help were met with Victoria's masterful manipulation. Items began appearing in Margaret's quarters, things that did not belong to her: Emily's hairbrush, a bracelet that had belonged to Sarah, prescription bottles from the bathroom cabinet. When confronted, Margaret denied taking them, but Victoria's performance of shock and concern was convincing enough to plant seeds of doubt in Richard's mind. "Perhaps Margaret is becoming forgetful," Victoria suggested gently to Richard one evening. "It's understandable at her age. Maybe it's time to consider whether she's still capable of handling her responsibilities, for everyone's safety." Richard felt torn. Margaret had been loyal for so many years, but Emily's well-being came first, and if there was even a possibility that the housekeeper was becoming unreliable, he had to consider it. The doubt, once planted, grew roots that spread through his confidence in Margaret's competence. The breaking point approached like a storm gathering on the horizon, dark and inevitable, its winds already beginning to howl through the carefully constructed facade of the Hartford family's new life. Winter descended upon Greenwich with unusual severity that year. Snow covered the Hartford estate in thick white blankets, turning the grounds into a pristine but isolated landscape. Inside, Emily felt the cold penetrating deeper than any winter chill, settling into her bones and her heart. Victoria's control had become absolute. She orchestrated Emily's entire existence with the precision of a master conductor, each note of the girl's day carefully planned and monitored. Emily rose at precisely 6 in the morning, dressed in clothes Victoria laid out the night before, and ate breakfast alone while Victoria observed from the doorway. Any deviation from perfect behavior resulted in consequences that left no visible marks, but carved deep wounds in Emily's spirit. The child had learned to hide, not just physically, though she spent hours in closets and under beds when she could, but emotionally. She constructed walls around her heart, burying her pain so deep that even she sometimes forgot it was there. She stopped crying where anyone could see. She stopped asking for help. She stopped hoping that her father would notice. At school, Victoria maintained her facade of the devoted stepmother. She volunteered for committees, praised Emily publicly, and expressed touching concern about the girl's shyness and academic struggles. What the other parents and teachers saw was a woman making noble efforts with a difficult, withdrawn child. What they did not see was Victoria's grip on Emily's arm in the parking lot, her whispered threats disguised as encouragement, her systematic destruction of the girl's sense of self-worth. Margaret had nearly given up. The incidents of items appearing in her room had escalated, and Richard's trust in her had eroded to the point where he questioned her version of events. She considered leaving, packing her bags and walking away from the house where she had spent the best years of her life. But every time she looked at Emily, saw the silent plea in those dimming eyes, she found she could not abandon the child. So she stayed, diminished and doubted but present. One night in late February, Emily lay awake in her transformed bedroom staring at the ceiling. The hunger in her stomach had become familiar, almost comfortable in its constancy. Victoria had decided that Emily was developing poor eating habits and needed portion control. Dinner had been 3 tablespoons of cold vegetables and a piece of dry toast. It was, Victoria explained to Richard when he briefly joined them, a scientifically balanced meal for a growing child. Richard, distracted by a crisis at the firm, had nodded absently and returned to his study. Emily thought about her mother. The memories were fragments now, pieces of a puzzle she could no longer assemble into a complete picture. She remembered warmth and laughter and feeling safe, but the details were gone, erased by time and Victoria's methodical removal of every reminder. The photograph that used to sit on Emily's nightstand had vanished. The music box her mother gave her had been accidentally broken during cleaning. Even the blanket her mother had wrapped her in as a baby had disappeared, donated to a charity drive Victoria organized. Something inside Emily finally fractured. It was not a dramatic break, but a quiet crumbling, like a structure weakened over time finally collapsing under its own weight. She could not do this anymore. She could not pretend to be the perfect daughter Victoria demanded. She could not continue existing in this house that had become a prison. She waited until after midnight when the house settled into silence. She dressed in layers, moving as quietly as possible, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain it would wake everyone. She took nothing with her except a small drawing she had hidden behind her dresser, one of the last pictures she had made of her mother before the memories faded completely. The front door was locked, but Emily knew about the window in the library that did not latch properly. She had discovered it months ago, a small flaw in Victoria's otherwise perfect domain. She squeezed through the opening, dropping into the snow-covered bushes below. The cold hit her immediately, shocking and brutal, but she pushed forward. The estate sat 2 miles from the main road. Emily walked down the long driveway, her thin jacket inadequate against the bitter wind. She had no plan beyond escape, no destination in mind. She just walked, her feet growing numb, her breathing becoming labored, her body beginning to shut down from cold and exhaustion. A Connecticut State Police cruiser spotted her at 2:43 in the morning, a small figure stumbling along Route 104, barefoot despite the snow, her lips blue from hypothermia. Officer Jennifer Chen pulled over immediately, wrapping the child in emergency blankets and calling for an ambulance. Emily was conscious but unresponsive, her eyes wide but seeing nothing, her body trembling uncontrollably. The hospital staff treated her for exposure and malnutrition. The pediatrician who examined her documented concerns that went beyond the immediate medical crisis. A social worker was called. Questions were asked. By morning, Emily's attempted escape had triggered an official investigation by the Department of Children and Families. Richard received the call at 4 in the morning. He arrived at the hospital in a state of shock that bordered on disbelief. His daughter, his Emily, had tried to run away in the middle of winter. The implications were too enormous to process. He sat by her hospital bed, watching her sleep under heated blankets, and felt the first cracks forming in the wall he had built around his emotions. Victoria arrived an hour later, her performance flawless. She wept. She expressed horror and confusion. She blamed herself for not seeing the signs of Emily's emotional distress. The nurses found her grief touching. Richard found it reassuring. Only Margaret, who came despite Victoria's attempts to keep her away, watched the stepmother with narrowed eyes and finally understood the full scope of the danger Emily faced. The media caught wind of the story within days. A prominent businessman's daughter attempting to flee her home made for compelling headlines. Reporters gathered outside the hospital, then outside the Hartford estate. The investigation proceeded with bureaucratic thoroughness, social workers conducting interviews, examining Emily's medical records, inspecting the house. Victoria was brilliant under scrutiny. She had left no evidence of physical harm. The notes she had written were destroyed. The diary of failures was hidden. Emily, traumatized and conditioned to silence, said nothing about the abuse. She simply stared at the wall and refused to eat. Richard faced a terrible possibility. If the investigation concluded that Emily was not safe in his home, she would be removed from his custody. The thought awakened something in him that grief and workaholism had suppressed. He realized with devastating clarity that he had failed his daughter. He had been so consumed by his own pain, so determined to maintain control through distance, that he had handed her over to someone who saw her as an object to be controlled rather than a child to be loved. The turning point came 2 weeks after Emily's hospitalization. She had been released back home under strict supervision, with mandatory therapy and regular check-ins from social services. Richard made a decision that shocked his entire company. He announced he would be taking an indefinite leave of absence to focus on family matters. His partners expressed concern, but Richard was immovable. Nothing mattered more than Emily. He began attending her therapy sessions, sitting in the waiting room at first, then being invited to participate. The therapist, Dr. Sarah Monroe, was patient and perceptive. She worked with Emily through art therapy, encouraging the child to express through drawings what she could not voice in words. Richard watched as his daughter created dark, disturbing images of shadows and cages and faceless figures looming over a small girl. One afternoon, Dr. Monroe suggested that Richard surprise Emily at school with lunch. It was meant to be a gesture of connection, a breaking of routine that showed Emily her father was present and engaged. Richard agreed, purchasing Emily's favorite meal from a local restaurant and arriving at Riverside Academy during the lunch period. He walked into the cafeteria with a smile, searching for his daughter among the students. What he saw stopped him cold. Emily sat alone at a table in the far corner, isolated from the other children. Victoria stood beside her, and as Richard watched, frozen in place, his wife removed the lunch Emily had brought from home and replaced it with a container of cold, congealed leftovers. Emily stared at the food with an expression of such defeated acceptance that Richard felt his heart crack open. Victoria spoke to Emily in a voice too low for others to hear, but Richard saw his daughter's shoulders curl inward, saw tears slide silently down her face, saw the absolute hopelessness in her posture, and in that moment, every manipulation, every subtle undermining, every careful lie crystallized into horrifying clarity. He crossed the cafeteria in long strides, his presence commanding enough that conversations stopped. Victoria looked up, her expression shifting rapidly from surprise to a calculated smile. "Richard, what a wonderful surprise. I was just discussing Emily's nutrition plan with her." Richard looked at his daughter, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time in years. He saw how thin she had become, how the light had left her eyes, how she sat with the stillness of someone who had learned that movement brought punishment. He saw what he should have seen months ago. "Get away from her," he said, his voice quiet but carrying absolute authority. Victoria's smile faltered. Richard picked up the container of cold leftovers, examined it, then looked at his wife with an expression that made her take a step back. "We're leaving. Now." What followed happened with swift precision. Richard contacted his attorneys that afternoon. He filed for an emergency protective order, removing Victoria from the house. He initiated divorce proceedings, citing evidence of emotional and psychological abuse. He cooperated fully with the DCF investigation, providing complete access to Emily's medical records, therapy notes, and his own observations of Victoria's behavior. Victoria fought back with the weapons she knew best. She went to the media, painting herself as a devoted stepmother abandoned by a controlling, emotionally unstable man. She gave tearful interviews about trying to help a troubled child. She hired expensive attorneys who questioned Richard's parenting and his long absences from home. Some of his business partners, concerned about the publicity, distanced themselves from him. Contracts were quietly cancelled. The Hartford name, once synonymous with success, became associated with scandal. Richard discovered he did not care. For the first time in his adult life, money and status meant nothing compared to his daughter's well-being. He sold the Greenwich estate, the symbol of his achievements and all the memories it contained. He resigned from Hartford Financial Group, the company he had, built from nothing. He let go of everything except Emily and Margaret, who had stood by them through the worst of it. They moved to a small house on the shore of Lake Candlewood, a modest place with wide windows overlooking the water. Margaret came with them, not as hired help but as family. Together, the three of them began the slow work of healing. Richard learned to cook breakfast, burning toast and overcooking eggs, until Emily actually smiled at his attempts. He learned to sit in silence, not filling every moment with productivity, but simply being present. He attended every therapy session, every medical appointment, every small moment of Emily's life. He asked for her opinion on curtain colors, on furniture placement, on what kind of tree to plant in the yard. He showed her, through consistent action, that her voice mattered. Emily's recovery was not linear. There were setbacks and nightmares and days when she could not get out of bed. But there were also mornings when she laughed at breakfast, afternoons when she painted by the lake, evenings when she fell asleep feeling safe. Slowly, incrementally, the child who had learned to hide began to emerge again. Margaret watched it all with quiet satisfaction, knowing that the family she had loved for so long was finally becoming whole. She baked cookies with Emily, taught her to garden, shared stories about her mother that kept Sarah's memory alive in healthy, loving ways. 2 years after the move to Lake Candlewood, Richard established the Emily Hartford Foundation. Its mission was to support children who had survived psychological trauma, providing therapy, art programs, and safe spaces for healing. The Lake House became the Foundation's first center, a place where children could come to be heard, to be believed, to be protected. Emily, now 14, became involved in the Foundation's work. She led art therapy groups, sharing her own story when she felt strong enough, helping other children find their voices through creativity. She decided she wanted to study psychology, to understand trauma and healing, to help others the way Dr. Monroe had helped her. The years passed. Emily graduated from high school, then college, then earned her doctorate in clinical psychology. She returned to the foundation her father had created in her name, now expanded to multiple locations across Connecticut and beyond. She continued his work, but with the unique perspective of someone who had lived through the darkness and found her way to light. On a spring evening when Emily was 28, she stood on a stage at the National Conference on Child Welfare. The auditorium was filled with social workers, therapists, educators, and policymakers. She had been invited to share her story as part of a keynote presentation on recognizing and addressing psychological abuse in children. Richard sat in the third row, his hair now more gray than dark, his face lined with the years but softer than it had been. Margaret sat beside him, holding his hand. They watched as Emily took the microphone, poised and confident, no trace remaining of the broken child she had been. Emily spoke for 40 minutes. She talked about the insidious nature of psychological abuse, how it left no bruises but carved deep scars. She discussed the importance of listening to children, believing their unspoken distress, creating systems that could identify harm that hid behind smiles and proper appearances. She spoke about her own experience, naming her pain without shame, describing her father's awakening and transformation. Her father, she said, her voice strong and clear, had to learn something. We all must learn that providing for children is not enough, that comfort and security matter, but love and presence matter more, that sometimes we must let go of everything we think defines us to save what truly matters. My father made mistakes, terrible mistakes that cost me years of suffering. But he also made the hardest choice any parent can make. He chose to see the truth, even when it shattered his world. He chose to rebuild from nothing, not his empire, but his relationship with me. And that choice saved my life. Richard felt tears sliding down his face, not from sadness, but from profound gratitude. Emily looked directly at him from the stage and smiled, the same smile she had given him that morning at breakfast, warm and genuine and free. After the conference, they drove back to Lake Candlewood together. Margaret had prepared dinner, and they ate on the porch overlooking the water as the sun set in shades of pink and gold. Emily pulled out her sketch pad, something she still did when she felt content, and began drawing. "What are you creating?" Richard asked, leaning over to see. Emily showed him the image taking shape. It was a house by a lake, windows glowing with warm light, 3 figures visible inside, together. Above the house, she had drawn a bright sun breaking through clouds. "I'm drawing a place where everyone feels safe," she said softly. "A home built on presence, not perfection. Where mistakes are forgiven and healing happens slowly. Where shadows are acknowledged but light always wins." Richard pulled his daughter into an embrace, holding her close, grateful beyond words for this second chance. Margaret smiled from the doorway, her heart full. The darkness of those terrible years had not disappeared from their history. They carried the scars, the memories, the knowledge of how close they had come to losing everything that mattered. But they also carried the strength that came from surviving, from choosing love over pride, connection over control, healing over hiding. Emily continued to draw as the stars emerged above Lake Candlewood. Her father sat beside her in comfortable silence, finally understanding that this quiet moment of togetherness was the only success that truly mattered. They had walked through fire and emerged transformed. Now they dedicated their lives to helping others find their own path from darkness to light, using their story not as a source of shame, but as a beacon of hope. The foundation continued to grow, touching thousands of lives, creating safe spaces where children could be seen, heard, and protected. Emily's work became nationally recognized, her voice a powerful advocate for systemic change in how society identified and addressed childhood trauma. But her greatest joy remained the simple moments by the lake, painting with her father, laughing with Margaret, living in the light they had fought so hard to find.